The wind had a voice in the Colorado Valley, low and lonely, the kind that could make a woman forget she'd once been young. Mara Quinn stood outside her cabin, tall as the doorframe she'd built herself, her shadow stretching across the frost-bitten field. The townsfolk called her the Giant Widow, though she'd stopped correcting them years ago. Her husband's grave lay behind the barn, marked only by a smooth river stone and a prayer she no longer spoke. She lived by rhythm now, chopping, mending, feeding her hens, and sleeping when the dark stopped whispering long enough to let her rest. No one visited. No one dared. The last traveler who'd come through left muttering about the cursed woman who worked alone. She let them say it. Loneliness hurt less when you wore it like armor. That afternoon, the sky went gray too fast. A storm gathered beyond the ridge, the kind that split wagons and crushed travelers against the rocks. Mara had seen the signs before, the sudden hush of birds, the smell of rain that wasn't rain yet. She was halfway to closing the barn door when she heard it, the distant creak of wheels and the panicked whinny of a horse. She froze. The sound grew louder, closer, until a battered wagon lurched into view, one wheel splintered, the driver shouting to calm the team. Without thinking, Mara ran toward the road. "Whoa!" she called, her voice echoing like thunder. The horse reared, but her hands, strong, certain, caught the bridle and steadied it. The driver stared up at her, soaked and bleeding from a cut on his forehead. "Ma'am," he gasped. "The storm, lost the trail. Kids." He motioned to the back, where two small shapes huddled under a wet blanket. "You can't stay out here," Mara said. "There's shelter up the rise." "We'll make it," he started, but a bolt of lightning struck the ridge behind them, close enough to shake the ground. Mara didn't argue again. She gripped the wagon's side and helped steer it toward her cabin, mud swallowing their boots. The children didn't make a sound, not even when thunder rolled above like cannon fire. Inside, she lit the hearth, the flame sputtering before it caught. "Sit," she ordered. The man obeyed, collapsing into the nearest chair. He looked too young to have the wear he carried, maybe 30, maybe less. "Name's Eli Carter," he said, chest still heaving. "We were headed north." "Not tonight," she replied. "You'll stay till the storm breaks." He nodded, glancing around at the simple room, the stacked wood, the hanging herbs, the neat rows of tools that said she'd learned how to survive without anyone's help. "Kids'll be no trouble," he murmured. Mara crouched beside the little ones, unwrapping the blanket, a boy and a girl, eyes wide, silent as the wind outside. "They yours?" she asked. "No," he said quietly. "Their folks didn't make it. I couldn't leave them." She studied him for a long moment before pulling another log from the pile. "Then you did right." He met her eyes, something raw flickering there. "You don't even know me." "Don't need to," she said, feeding the fire. "Anybody who carries orphans through a storm don't need an introduction." The wind howled against the walls, shaking the shutters, but inside her cabin, for the first time in years, the silence felt different, less like loneliness and more like waiting. By morning, the world outside was white and still, the storm having buried everything it couldn't break. The cabin roof moaned under the weight of snow, and inside, the hearth was down to its last embers. Mara Quinn rose before dawn, as she always did, tying her dark hair back with a strip of twine and moving through the cold like a woman used to it. Eli Carter lay on a cot she'd dragged in from the porch, his coat folded over his chest, one boot missing, and the other still wet by the fire. The children slept beside him, curled together beneath one of her quilts. For a moment, Mara just stood there, arms crossed, listening to the soft rhythm of breathing, the kind that didn't belong in her house anymore. It felt almost indecent, that sound of life after so many years of quiet. She stirred the coals, fed them bark, and soon the smell of smoke and thawing air filled the room. Eli woke to it, blinking into the golden light. "Morning," he said, voice rough. "Still here, then?" "You're lucky the roof held," she said. "That wind could have taken us both." "Would have been my luck. Thank you for not letting it." "Didn't do it for thanks," she said, handing him a mug of hot water. "Drink that. Coffee's for when work starts." He smiled faintly. "You always this kind to strangers?" "No," she replied. "Just the ones who bring children to my door." The boy stirred then, sitting up, hair sticking every which way. The little girl followed, rubbing her eyes, clutching the edge of her blanket. "We hungry," the boy whispered, too polite to whine. Mara hesitated only a second before moving to the cupboard, pulling out a loaf of hard bread and a jar of honey. "Sit," she said. The children obeyed, and soon the sound of chewing and soft laughter filled the room, strange and unfamiliar music to her ears. Eli watched her move, his expression unreadable. "They've been on the road 3 weeks," he said quietly. "Ate snow more than food." "They'll eat better here," she said, her tone clipped, but there was gentleness under it. "What's their story?" "Found them outside Julesburg. Their parents burned with their cabin. No kin left." Mara paused, her hands tightening around the bread knife. "And you?" "Just a man who couldn't keep walking." "That a habit of yours? Collecting lost souls?" He almost laughed, but didn't. "Maybe it's my punishment. Or maybe it's the only thing that still feels right." She glanced at him, something curious flickering behind her eyes. "The town won't like it," she said finally. "They already talk when I buy supplies alone. If they see you here—" "Then let 'em talk," he said simply. "Talk never killed anyone." "You ain't been to Dry Hollow long," she murmured. "Words can hang a person faster than rope out here." He studied her for a long moment. "Then maybe it's time someone gave them something worth talking about." She met his gaze, and for the first time since she'd buried her husband, Mara didn't look away. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and a weak sunlight crept across the valley, touching the window pane like a promise. Inside that cabin, 3 strangers and a widow ate bread and honey together, and though none of them said it, they all knew something had begun that the storm couldn't wash away. By dusk, the cabin glowed like a lantern against the deep snow, the faint hiss of the hearth filling the silence between breaths. Mara Quinn sat by the fire, mending one of Eli's shirts, though she pretended it was just another chore. The children were on the floor nearby, building little fences out of kindling sticks, their laughter soft, hesitant, the sound of people who hadn't forgotten fear, but were learning what warmth sounded like again. Eli knelt beside the hearth, his broad hands steady as he turned a pot of stew she'd taught him to stir every so often. Outside, the snow fell slower now, fat flakes catching the lamplight through the window. No one spoke much. Words felt heavy, unnecessary. The air between them was built of smaller things, glances that lingered, shoulders brushing when someone passed too close. The way his shadow moved when she rose to check the stew. When the pot finally stopped steaming, she filled 4 bowls and laid them out on the table. No prayer, no invitation. Just the sound of spoons scraping tin and the slow, grateful sighs of people who hadn't eaten properly in weeks. The boy grinned when he found a piece of carrot in his bowl. The girl smiled at her reflection in the metal. Mara saw it all and said nothing, her own spoon pausing halfway to her lips, as if she were memorizing the shape of this moment. When the meal was done, she wiped her hands on her apron and reached for the bread she'd set to rise that morning. The dough was firm, alive. She shaped it with care, then slid it onto the iron plate above the fire. Eli watched her hands, calloused yet graceful, the way they moved with memory, not thought. When the scent filled the room, warm, deep, something like hope, the girl began to hum, a tune with no words. Mara froze, the sound twisting through her like a ghost she'd forgotten she missed. Without meaning to, she smiled, a small, quiet curve that lit her face softer than the firelight ever could. Eli noticed and said nothing. He only reached for the bread when it was done, and broke it into pieces, handing the first one to her. She took it without meeting his eyes. It was an unspoken understanding. No one in that room was hungry for food alone. When the children fell asleep beside the hearth, wrapped in their fatherless dreams, Mara stood at the door, looking out at the moonlit ridge. Eli came up behind her, the soft scrape of his boots the only sound. He didn't touch her, didn't speak. She didn't turn. They just stood there, side by side, breathing the same cold air. It was a wordless kind of peace, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just settles in like snow on a roof. Quiet, inevitable, and fragile enough to vanish if either of them tried to name it. When the thaw came, it carried gossip faster than the river. The snow melted into mud, the mud into rumors. And before long, the people of Dry Hollow began talking about the giant widow, who'd taken a strange man into her home and fed his children through the storm. Mara Quinn didn't need to hear it to know. It was in the way the shopkeeper stopped calling her ma'am, in how the women at the well turned their shoulders when she passed. The butcher's wife crossed the street rather than meet her eyes. By noon, even the preacher had found a verse to whisper too loud. A woman should not take what is not hers to take. Mara kept her chin high, her voice steady as she bought what she needed, but the weight of eyes followed her like flies on meat. She hauled the flour sacks herself, the muscles in her arms flexing under her shawl, her boots sinking deep in the thawing ground. When she reached home, Eli was chopping wood, the children chasing a chicken through the yard. "Town's awake," she said, dropping the flour inside. "They'll quiet down," he answered, not looking up. "They never quiet down. They wait till it burns." "Then let it," he said, splitting another log clean through. "Fire don't scare me." "It should," she said softly. "Out here it's always righteous first, then hungry later." He looked at her then, eyes the color of dirt after rain. "You can send us off if you want, but I'm not leaving because they can't mind their own prayers." "You think it's that simple?" she asked. "You've got 2 little mouths to feed. I can handle the talk. You can't afford it." He leaned on the axe handle, breathing hard. "You think I don't know what talk can cost?" "I fought for men who'd shoot me if they saw my scars again. Let 'em talk, Mara. It's only words." "No," she said, her voice low. "It's a seed. And once it's planted, you can't stop what grows." The silence after that was heavy as smoke. Inside, the children began to sing something tuneless but happy. It cut through the tension like sunlight through shutters. Eli glanced toward the sound and smiled faintly. "They don't hear it," he said. "The whispers, the hate." "They will," she murmured. "They always do." Later, when she carried bread into town to sell, she heard the laughter before she saw them. The women, all polished boots and sharp tongues. "Maybe she thinks feeding him means she's married now," one said. "Maybe she thinks she can buy a man the way she buys flour," another added. Mara didn't slow her steps. "At least I pay for what I keep," she said without looking at them, and for once their laughter stopped. That night, Eli found her outside, staring into the valley where the lights of town glowed faint and distant. "You told them," he said quietly. "No," she replied. "I reminded them who they're talking about." He grinned then, slow and proud. "Good. Let the whole valley know we're still standing." For the first time in years, Mara felt it too. The strange, solid warmth of not standing alone. That night the wind changed, carrying the ache of sickness before anyone spoke it aloud. The boy coughed once, then twice, a sound too deep for his small chest. Mara Quinn set her bread knife down and crossed the room, her fingers pressing to his forehead. Hot, slick, wrong. "He's burning," she said. Eli was beside her in seconds, his rough hand trembling as he felt the same heat. "He was fine at supper," he whispered. "It came fast," she said. "Fever always does." She moved with a calm born of panic well hidden, pulling blankets from the chest, fetching water, grinding herbs she hadn't touched since her husband's last days. Eli followed every order without question. More firewood, more water. Hold him steady. The girl stood silent by the hearth, clutching a rag doll as the cabin filled with the sound of ragged breathing and the hiss of boiling cloths. Mara dipped one into the basin and pressed it to the boy's skin. "You'll stay with me, here?" she murmured, the words low, meant more for herself than him. Eli knelt opposite her, his face drawn. "You know what you're doing," he said. "You sound like a woman who's done this before." She didn't answer. The memory was too sharp. Another body, another fever, another night that had ended with dirt under her fingernails and silence in her bed. She changed the cloth, then another, whispering between breaths. "Not this time. Not again." Outside, the wind howled through the valley, rattling the shutters. Hours stretched thin. Eli's voice cracked once when he said the boy's name, and Mara reached across the bed, her hand finding his. "Steady," she said. "He'll follow your strength." Their eyes met over the trembling child, the firelight cutting shadows over both faces, hers worn and lined, his raw and open, the kind of man who'd seen too much death to believe easily in life. Just before dawn, the fever broke. The boy's breath slowed, his lips no longer dry, his hand twitching weakly toward the cup beside him. Mara let out a sound that wasn't quite a sob, not quite a laugh, something caught between both. Eli exhaled hard, sitting back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "You prayed," he said quietly. "Did I?" "He's alive," he answered. "I reckon someone listened." She looked at him then, the tired strength in his smile, the gratitude he didn't know how to say. "I don't pray for miracles anymore," she said. "Just mercy enough to try again tomorrow?" He nodded slowly. "That's the kind of prayer I can believe in." When the sun finally rose, painting the snow gold outside the window, Mara stood and poured water over her hands, watching it steam as it touched her skin. "We'll need broth, rest, and quiet," she said. "And you?" Eli asked. She hesitated. "I'll keep watch." He looked at her for a long moment, something unspoken hanging between them. "Then I'll keep you." The words landed soft but steady, like the first light breaking through after a long storm. The sun rose slow over the valley, spilling pale gold across the frost and lighting the cabin window where steam still ghosted from the kettle. Inside, everything felt fragile, like the world might shatter if anyone breathed too loud. The fevered boy slept deeply now, one arm across his chest, his hair damp with the sweat of survival. Mara Quinn sat beside him, her head tilted back against the wall, eyes closed but not asleep. The long night still clung to her bones. When she finally stirred, it was to the soft rustle of cloth. Eli Carter had covered her with his own coat, the one still torn at the sleeve from the wagon wreck. She looked at him across the room, standing at the window, back turned, his broad shoulders outlined by the dawn. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was companionable. Full of things understood without saying. The girl was outside with the chickens, her laughter carried faintly on the wind, a sound that made the cabin seem like a home instead of a shelter. Eli turned when he noticed Mara watching him. Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither moved. He smiled, barely, but enough, and nodded toward the field. "Sun's out." His lips seemed to form, though no sound followed. She understood anyway. She rose slowly, checked the boy's pulse one last time, and stepped out into the clean air. The snow was already retreating, revealing the dull green of winter grass, the fence half buried, the road that led back toward the town they'd both rather forget. She carried a bucket to the well, her steps sure and deliberate, her breath visible in the cold. Eli joined her after a moment, lifting the rope to help draw the water. Neither spoke. The bucket rose between them, heavy with cold reflection. They shared its weight like they'd shared the night, half burden, half promise. The chickens pecked near their boots. The wind carried the smell of pine and smoke, and somewhere down the valley, the church bell tolled faintly, calling a town still half asleep. When Mara's hands brushed his as she took the bucket, she didn't pull away. The moment passed, simple and real, like two people remembering what it meant to belong. Back inside, the boy stirred, murmuring something in his sleep that made the girl run to his side. Mara followed, brushing her fingers gently across his forehead. Cool now, soft and alive. Eli leaned against the doorway, watching them. When she looked up, she caught him staring, his face unreadable. But his eyes held something she hadn't seen in a long time. Peace. He crossed the room and crouched beside the bed, resting his hand over the boy's. The girl reached for his other hand without fear this time. In that silence, there were no declarations, no questions, no ghosts from the war or graves from the past, only the living warmth of hands joined across the firelight. When the kettle whistled again, Mara rose and poured him a cup. He accepted it with a nod. No words. None were needed. Outside, the light brightened across the valley, and inside, for the first time in years, the house felt like it remembered how to breathe. By the time the river thawed and the mud turned to dust again, peace had started to feel almost ordinary. The children played without fear. Eli repaired the corral, and Mara Quinn began to believe maybe silence could be a home rather than a punishment. Then one morning a shadow stretched across the field, tall, deliberate, carrying the rhythm of authority. Sheriff Briggs rode slow up the slope, his badge catching the sun. She saw him from the porch and felt that old weight settle across her chest, the kind that comes when you know peace has never been meant to last long out here. "Morning, Widow Quinn," he said, dismounting with the stiffness of a man who'd come to deliver words he didn't want to say. "Sheriff," she answered evenly. "You here for bread or trouble?" "Depends who you ask," he said, dusting off his coat. Eli came out from the barn, eyes narrow, shoulders squared. "Something wrong?" "Not yet," Briggs replied, though his glance lingered on the boy stacking firewood near the steps. "You've taken in Orphans, Carter. Folks been talking." "Folks talk when they've got too much daylight and not enough work," Eli said. "The law don't move on gossip." "This ain't gossip," Briggs said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "The territory board's clear. A man keeping children not of his blood without guardianship papers is a suspect in trafficking. I'm here to take him to town until it's sorted." Mara's heart froze cold. The girl's small hands stopped moving. "You'll do no such thing," Mara said, stepping between the sheriff and the doorway. "You can take your law back down that hill." "Ma'am, I ain't your enemy," he said. "But rules are rules." "Rules didn't keep them alive," she said sharply. "That man did, and this house did. You can write that in your report." Briggs looked at her, something flickering in his eyes. Respect or regret, she couldn't tell. "You're making this harder than it has to be." "No," Eli said quietly, stepping closer. "You are." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind pushing through the apple trees and the creak of leather as Briggs shifted his weight. "I'll be back in 2 days, the sheriff finally said. "If you got proof of guardianship or a preacher's blessing, maybe I can look the other way. Otherwise, I take the kids." He turned, mounting his horse again. 2 days, he repeated, and rode off toward the ridge. Mara stood there long after he disappeared, her jaw tight, her breath sharp. The boy tugged her sleeve. "Are we in trouble, ma'am?" he whispered. She crouched down, meeting his eyes. "Not as long as I've got breath in me." Eli ran a hand through his hair, pacing once before stopping beside her. "We can run," he said. "Head north before morning." "And teach them to spend their lives running?" she said. "No, we'll face it here." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw something in her that silenced every argument. "Then we stand," he said finally. Mara nodded once. "Together," she said. And for the first time, the word didn't sound like a promise. It sounded like a vow. 2 days later, the air over Dry Hollow felt like it was waiting for something to break. Word had spread faster than dust. By the time Mara Quinn and Eli Carter reached town, half the valley had gathered outside the courthouse. The sheriff's horse stood tied by the post, his hat low against the sun, and beside him the preacher whispered to a cluster of wives dressed like judgment itself. The orphans clung to Mara's skirts, their faces pale. "Stay close," she told them. Eli's hand brushed her shoulder once, not in comfort, but in quiet defiance. The crowd parted as they walked, whispers fluttering like leaves. "There she is, the giant widow with the soldier. Those ain't her children. He's hiding something." Every word hit, but none found a mark deep enough to wound anymore. Mara had faced worse storms than mouths. The sheriff stepped forward. "Mara," he said, trying to sound kind. "We talked about this. The law's the law." "And mercy's still mercy," she replied. "You said a preacher's blessing could make it right." "If the preacher agrees," Briggs said carefully, turning toward Reverend Haskins. The old man's mouth was tight, his Bible clutched like a weapon. "She lives in sin," he announced. "Took a man into her home without wedlock. No oath, no altar, no shame." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mara didn't flinch. "I took in hunger," she said evenly, "and sickness, and 2 children who would have frozen under the Lord's sky. If that's sin, then maybe heaven's full of better people than me." A few men shifted, uncertain. Briggs looked uneasy. "We don't mean to take what's yours, ma'am," he said softly. "But the law says—" "The law says," she cut in, "a woman can't own land, can't claim kin, and can't speak unless spoken to. Maybe the law's the thing that's sick." The silence that followed was wide and deep. Eli stepped beside her, removing his hat. "If there's shame," he said, "then it's mine. I asked her to take us in. I'd be dead without her." The preacher sneered. "Then make it proper." Eli looked at Mara, his jaw tightening. "If I have to stand before God to keep these children safe," he said, "then so be it. Marry me." The crowd gasped. Mara's breath caught, not from surprise, but from the weight of all that had led here. The storm, the fever, the firelight. "You sure?" she whispered. "I ain't much for promises." "I've seen what you are," he said. "That's promise enough?" The preacher hesitated, searching the crowd for support, but the murmurs had shifted. A woman near the front said, "Let him." Then another echoed it. The sheriff sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Fine," he muttered. "Let it be done." Under a sun that burned hotter than judgment, Reverend Haskins mumbled his reluctant words. Eli and Mara stood side by side, their hands joined, the children between them. No ring, no veil, no choir, just truth spoken plain. When it was done, the preacher turned away first. Mara met the crowd's stare, her chin high. "You wanted something proper," she said. "Now you've got it." A week after the wedding that wasn't meant to be, Dry Hollow felt different. The same people who once whispered now tipped their hats when passing the ridge road. The baker sent loaves with extra crust, the blacksmith delivered nails without asking for coin, and the preacher, too proud to apologize, left a jar of honey on their porch one morning before dawn. It was the town's way of saying we were wrong without letting pride die out loud. Mara Quinn accepted it with quiet grace, not because she needed their forgiveness, but because the children deserved to see that even hard hearts could change. The valley itself seemed to breathe easier. The grass rose greener, the orchard bloomed early, and laughter began to live where only silence had ruled. Eli rebuilt the barn with his own hands, the hammer echoing across the field like punctuation to every promise he'd made without words. The children chased each other through the rows of budding trees, their shoes muddy, their voices bright. Mara stood at the porch rail, arms folded, her eyes soft in a way they hadn't been since before widowhood had turned her into a ghost among the living. "You're smiling," Eli said behind her, brushing sawdust from his shirt. "Am I?" "Like you forgot how to frown." She smirked faintly. "Maybe I just ran out of reasons." He leaned beside her, the quiet settling comfortably between them. "You ever think about what's next?" "Next?" "Yeah," he said. "We got a house full of life now. Feels like we ought to fill it proper." "It's full enough," she said, but her tone lacked conviction. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small piece of cedar he'd whittled smooth. It wasn't fancy, just a curve of wood carved into a circle. "A ring," he said simply. "Didn't think you'd want a preacher's one." She looked at it, at him, at the calloused fingers that had built fences, carried sick children, and never once asked for anything in return. "You don't owe me that," she said softly. "Ain't about owing," he replied. "It's about staying." For a moment, all she could do was stare at the sunlight hitting his jaw, the sound of the children's laughter carrying on the wind. She took the ring and slipped it onto her thumb. "Then I guess you'd better finish that barn before it rains," she said, and walked back inside. Eli grinned, shaking his head. Later, as the afternoon faded, the townsfolk began arriving, quietly at first, one wagon at a time. They brought tools, bread, and nails. The same men who'd once mocked now stood hammering boards under her direction. No speeches, no apologies, just the rhythm of work and reconciliation. When the last plank was nailed, Mara stood at the doorway, looking out over the field. The sheriff nodded to her. The preacher tipped his hat, and even the gossiping wives offered awkward smiles. The sun dipped low behind the ridge, turning the sky amber. Eli came up beside her, brushing the back of her hand with his. "Looks like the valley remembered what mercy feels like," he murmured. "No," she said, her voice steady and full. "It learned it." Spring came soft and green to the valley, as if the earth itself had decided to forgive. The apple blossoms swayed over the rebuilt fences. The air smelled of rain and soil, and laughter came as easily as breathing. Mara Quinn stood at her doorway, hands dusted with flour, watching the children chase a red kite across the pasture. Eli was mending the harness near the barn, humming low, his shirt sleeves rolled high. It had been months since the storm that changed everything, but sometimes she still woke before dawn expecting silence, expecting emptiness. Instead, she'd hear Eli stirring the fire, the sound of boots on wood, the faint murmur of a home alive again. The peace that filled her now wasn't grand or loud. It was something smaller, deeper, like water settling after rain. A wagon creaked up the road, carrying a family she didn't know, a young couple, 3 thin children, a mule near collapse. They looked lost in that way she remembered too well. The man lifted his hat. "Ma'am, we heard there's a woman here who helps folks start over." Mara glanced at Eli, who had already set down his tools. "She might be around," she said. "Depends if they're the kind who give more than they take." The man's wife held up a sack of seed. "We just need a place to rest. We'll work for it." Mara studied them, the children's hollow eyes, the mud on their faces, and she felt something stir that had once been buried under grief. She stepped aside. "There's stew on the stove, water by the well. Feed the mule before you eat." The family hesitated, unsure, until Eli smiled and waved them forward. "Go on," he said. "She don't bite unless you forget to say thank you." The youngest child laughed, and just like that, they came. By sundown, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and bread again. The strangers slept near the hearth, the same way Eli and the orphans once had. When the house grew quiet, Mara stepped outside, looking down the slope toward the valley lights. The same breeze that carried her loneliness years ago now carried the faint sound of a lullaby from inside. Eli joined her at the doorway, the warmth of his arm brushing hers. "You did it again," he said softly. "Did what?" "Opened that door like you never learned how to keep it shut." She smiled, faint but true. "Maybe it's the only thing I ever learned right." He reached for her hand, rough against hers, solid and human. Together they stood there, watching the sky dim into violet and gold. The field below glimmered with fireflies, the same valley that once echoed with whispers now breathing with quiet mercy. When the children's laughter drifted from inside, Eli turned toward her. "You ever think about what they'll call this place one day?" She thought for a long moment, eyes soft. "Home," she said simply. And for once, that word didn't ache. It settled, real, earned, and enough. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you'd stood in Dry Hollow that day, would you have joined Mara and Eli or turned away with the crowd? Tell us in the comments.